really appreciate the opportunity to talk about something other than appropriations tonight, but something that appropriations certainly impacts, and that is the strategic competition that we're engaged with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. I just returned from Southeast Asia with Young Kim as part of our work on the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I also serve in the leadership of the Financial Services Committee and the National Security Subcommittee of that committee, where we deal with both inbound and outbound capital flows, international financial institutions, the Treasury's participation in those global organizations, and also Treasury's role in the implementation and enforcement of sanctions. And then I think because of those two assignments, the Speaker appointed me and my great staff, as Jim was pointing out, to work with Chairman Gallagher and Ranking Member Barr on this select committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. And I think where all of that jurisdiction intersects is this issue of economic competition with the CCP. And that's an underestimated dimension of the competition. But before I get to some comments about where I think the Select Committee is going, where the NDAA is going, where the Financial Services Committee is going on some of these economic issues, I do want to just touch on some kinetic activity that's happening in the Western Pacific right now. Because so much attention deservedly is focused on Taiwan and the threat of a cross-strait invasion. Many of our senior intelligence officials and DoD personnel, including Indo-PACOM, are very concerned with a window of time where Xi Jinping and the People's Liberation Army, especially I would say the PLA and the PLN, the People's Liberation Navy leadership, really believe that there is a closing window within which they can, by force, unify Taiwan with mainland China. And some experts think it could be as soon as 2027. But there is no doubt that when you look at the military activities in the Strait and around the democracy island of Taiwan over the last several weeks, that they are making preparations. They are making preparations for an invasion, and also you've seen a tempo that we have never seen before in terms of the sorties from the PLA. There was one day just last week where we saw 103 sorties of incursions in and around Taiwan airspace. Nearly half of those sorties involved incursions into the Taiwan air defense identification zone, crossing the midpoint line between China and Taiwan in the Strait. But what was very, very telling and new and different about these military exercises, which by the way were preceded by naval exercises that were very unusually large and extensive, a carrier group and many battle vessels, battleships from the PLN in and around Taiwan waters, was the fact that last week we saw a number of Chinese military aircraft going to the southeast and the eastern side of the island with refueling capabilities. And this is a clear signal that they are practicing for access denial. They want to train for U.S. Assistance, and they want to train for a air, land, and sea embargo of the island and deny access to U.S. military coming to the aid of Taiwan. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because of what we're also seeing in the South China Sea, or as our treaty, mutual defense treaty ally, the Philippines, refer to as the West Philippine Sea. When we traveled to Southeast Asia, Young Kim, Representative Jonathan Jackson, and Representative Crockett from Texas, bipartisan Codell, we went to Manila, and we also went to Subic Bay and Clark Air Base. We gave up Clark and Subic back in 1992 at the end of the Cold War. But we've recently expanded the number of EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, which are kind of like expeditionary bases, small expeditionary bases that are Philippine controlled but allow U.S. forces to operate with small footprint, light expeditionary bases for our aircraft and our vessels in cooperation with the Philippine Army, Navy, and their Coast Guard. What the Filipinos showed us was what's happening in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, which is that within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, there are at least 7 submerged reefs or shoals or marine formations, again, within the Philippine territorial waters, that the Chinese have simply annexed and built artificial islands on top of them. And in at least the case of 3 of these, they've built 3,000-meter runways that have military aircraft on them. They've built very sophisticated runway infrastructure, including hangars where they can forward deploy many of their aircraft, their military aircraft. They've got satellite communications. They've got capabilities for anti-aircraft. These are militarized islands designed for one thing only, and that is war. It is a violation of international law. A UN tribunal has adjudicated this unanimously, and the Chinese Communist Party, and this was just a few years ago, has said we do not recognize the United Nations. These are our islands. They call them islands, and they lay claim to them from the Middle East, and they call it the 9-dash line. And this is in violation of not only Philippine territorial waters, but also Brunei and Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, who are other claimant states. Why does this matter? Why does this matter in the case of a Taiwan invasion scenario? It matters because with these EDCA sites in the Philippines, which Indo-PACOM would want to pre-position our military assets to resupply and to join the fight with the Taiwanese in defense of their sovereignty or their pseudo-independence, de facto independence, whatever you want to call it, their democracy. What would happen would be that the Chinese would seek and attempt to deny access to the U.S. military. These artificial islands give them a flank that puts our armed forces in direct harm's way in a way that would require us to take on these island sites in advance of us going to reinforce the Taiwanese and break the embargo. So it's strategically very, very important. And we went up in and I've been cleared to share this, but our Codell, we went up into a P-8 Poseidon, which is a naval aircraft. And it is a sub-hunter, basically. You have air warfare officers on there who drop on the back of the plane buoys to hunt Chinese submarines. By the way, we have a qualitative edge in submarine technology, but they're getting better at it, and they're less stealthy than ours, but we need these Poseidons to identify their subs, near Taiwan, which is 440 nautical miles from the Philippines and the South China Sea. But these Poseidon aircraft, they are hunting subs all the time. But the other mission that they have is to intercept People's Liberation Navy and Chinese Coast Guard vessels which are harassing the Philippine Navy and the Philippine Coast Guard. You may have seen pictures on CNN or the news with these water cannons and these dangerous maneuvers where they're trying to, or they look like they're going to ram the Filipino vessels. What the Philippine military has done is, in order to prevent the Chinese from taking over other parts of their territorial waters, they've intentionally scuttled a old battleship on the Second Thomas Shoal, which is basically a submerged reef that you can see the waves from the air, but it's not quite outside of the water. The Chinese want it because it's very strategically located. They want to build another artificial island on top of it. To prevent that from happening, the Filipino Coast Guard resupplies Filipino Marines that are living 24/7 on that shipwreck. And the Chinese Coast Guard never leaves. They're all there waiting for the moment that the Filipino Marines escape or get off there, and then they'll take it over. And so there is constant resupply by the Filipino Coast Guard of these Marines, and moving them in and out of shifts. Well, the U.S. Navy is there to support the Filipino Marines. The Mutual Defense Treaty that we have says that an armed attack requires, it means it triggers a response. We are treaty bound to defend the Filipinos in that scenario. And so what happens is these Poseidons, these naval aircraft, they come every day and they are in direct contact and communication with the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Liberation Navy frigates that are harassing the Filipinos. And it was just so impressive to see our young, and I mean young, like 29-year-old pilot out of Georgia Tech and Naval Academy grads in their 20s and 30s, the air warfare officers on board with us, the professionalism with which they dealt with the confrontation. And the Chinese are yelling at the U.S. military aircraft, and we put on the headphones and we could hear them respond, and they would occasionally interject an English word here or there, Yankee, Yankee, this and that. But they were definitely threatening the U.S. military aircraft. And the pilot would respond with a script, very well done, very calm, cool, and collected, basically talking about this is a sovereign immune U.S. military aircraft operating beyond the airspace of any coastal state, according to international law, defending the freedom of navigation of every sovereign country. This is the United States Navy, do not engage. And we do that every day with the Chinese Navy. So this is not kinetic, but it's darn close. And miscalculation is a real risk. So anyway, I wanted to mention that before I talked about the economic competition, because this stuff is real. And they are preparing for war, and there's no other way to assess the situation. So what should we do about this situation? Deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. Military deterrence for sure. But on the economic front, we need to make sure that we don't aid the rise of the Chinese military capabilities. And we certainly shouldn't be funding the Chinese military civil fusion that assists the People's Liberation Army or the People's Liberation Navy, or their technological capabilities, which are frankly quite extensive and growing. And there is this theory, Graham Allison, the professor at Harvard, writes this book about the Thucydides trap, where a rising power and a declining power, that the inevitability of war is really serious and it's hard to avoid. I think the Chinese see themselves as an ascending power and the United States as a descending power. The key is that every morning that Xi Jinping wakes up, that we plant that seed of doubt in his mind so that there's sufficient deterrence that he doesn't make that mistake, either a miscalculation or a mistake of a cross-strait invasion. So we need military deterrence, but we also need economic deterrence. China is not a 12 feet tall adversary. They have their shortcomings. They have their liabilities. They're in a debt crisis right now. They have a demographic challenge. They're no longer the largest country in the world in terms of population. India has surpassed them because of their one-child policy. They've got a real estate crisis on their hands. The fact that they crack down on their own population makes them more afraid of their own people than of their adversary, the United States. So they've got a lot of problems, but we don't need to be unwittingly financing the rise of the Chinese military industrial complex. So in 2020, the estimate was the United States, U.S. investors held about $1.2 trillion of Chinese debt and equity securities. There is no doubt that there is a lot of Western capital that flows into China to fund their civil military fusion enterprise. Much of this access to our capital markets, to Western capital markets, has funded their technological advance. And so we've got to get smart about this. And we got to get smart about it in ways that do not send the wrong signal that we're trying to counter China by becoming more like China. We need to be the best version of ourselves. So it's an interesting and delicate balance between not sending the signal that we want to become more like China and turn away from our default view that cross-border capital flows is a good thing. We believe in free markets. We believe in open access and cross-border capital flows. But we've come to recognize that this view, this bipartisan view for 40 years, that if we just opened up access to our capital markets, if we traded with them, if we gave them most favored nation status, that they would democratize, they would liberalize, that they would adopt our market principles. They have not. They've used it to finance their rise and challenge American hegemony in the international order. So there's different approaches to how we should screen investment. We've done several things already. The Congress has in law. Certainly, we passed the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which opened up more auditing transparency of Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges that triggers a delisting if they don't adopt U.S. accounting standards. We've reduced that time period from 3 years to 2 years for them to come into compliance. A good law. I supported it, bipartisan. We have modernized our export controls with ECRA back in 2017-18, the Export Control Reform Act that was supposed to bolster the number of restrictions on our export controls to prevent that tech transfer, that theft of intellectual property. Commerce and BIS are a little bit behind in implementing that, but and there's a whole lot of licenses for those companies on the entity list. And that's receiving a lot of scrutiny now. We reformed CFIUS. We added real estate transactions, joint ventures, minority share investments to screen more of that to prevent malign inbound investment that facilitated tech transfer and threats to our national security. There was the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act that passed. So we've done some things, but it's this outbound piece that has gotten a lot of attention. And I suppose because of my jurisdictional interplay, I'm kind of been at the center of that. You may have read about the Biden administration's executive order. They issued in August an executive order that focused on quantum computing, microelectronics, chips, and artificial intelligence. There is a requirement that if it goes into the military, that there is a restriction. And if it's not going into the military, it's more of a disclosure requirement. That is somewhat of a sector-based approach, but narrow to those three sectors. Then there is the Casey Cornyn approach that has been kind of diminished now or minimized to more of a disclosure, and it's a sectoral-based, but many more sectors than just the executive order. And then there is our approach from the House Financial Services Committee and my bill, which we just marked up last week. And this bill is called the Chinese Military Company Sanctions, Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act. We think this is the best approach of the three. We do have a sector-based approach from the standpoint that we require all of the agencies involved to look at and scrutinize companies, entities, Chinese entities that fall into these sectors as deserving of extra scrutiny for purposes of placing them on these lists. But we do it differently than Cornyn and the executive order from the Biden administration in that we require precision, clarity, and certainty for the private sector, for both U.S. and non-U.S. investors. We want an entity-based approach where we sanction using full SDN blocking sanctions under the powers of OFAC and Treasury to make it perfectly clear to investors, green light, red light. This is off limits. And not only is it off limits for an investment, whether it be a U.S. or public exchange, in the U.S. or off the U.S., whether it's a private company, private equity, private credit, or venture capital, whether it's a trading relationship or any transaction, it's off limits. It's a full SDN blocking sanction. What is the virtue of using OFAC as opposed to a reverse CFIUS or anything else, or the Commerce Department or DOD? The virtue is that a full blocking SDN sanction designation means you can't do anything. It's not just a restriction on U.S. investors. It's not just a restriction on or a delisting requirement of U.S. exchanges, publicly listed exchange, publicly traded listed exchanges. It is a restriction on everything. Trade, transactions, all kinds of capital flows. And it has a multilateral effect, unlike many of these other ideas, unlike the executive orders. When the U.S. sanctions an entity, a Chinese entity from OFAC, it sends a signal to non-U.S. investors, non-U.S. players, our allies in Europe and Asia. We have a choice. We can either do business with this Chinese entity, or we can do business with the United States, but we can't do both. So we think that's the virtue. This conversation is going to happen in the NDAA. I don't think the approaches are mutually exclusive, but we think our approach is the best, of course. Because again, it would give your companies, the private sector, the certainty and clarity, red light, green light, and the strategic decoupling that needs to happen. Because not all outbound investment or investment in China is necessarily bad. In fact, and I'll end with this, some investment actually threatens the regime. And so again, the House Financial Services Committee is taking the approach that, look, exporting bourbon into mainland China doesn't threaten our national security, but strengthens the Kentucky economy, right? And some investment in benign industries in China that open up China to Western values actually threatens the regime. So that strategic approach of de-risking, decoupling in precise ways and direct ways with clarity, we think is the best approach going forward to protect American national security, but also protect our values.